Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 841st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Eunice Bellador, Melissa Cowley Wolf, Julia V. Hendrickson, Lise K. Ragbeer, Phyllis Hollis, James McAnally, and Allison Glenn. We are thrilled to welcome poet Estelle Araya-S here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Montreal-born Eunice Bellador is a curator, author, researcher, and professor. In her current practice, she looks at questioning as a method and at letter writing as creating auto theory and its intersection with care, feminism, and racial issues. Melissa Cowley Wolf is an advisor, author, speaker, yoga instructor, and coach. In 2017, she founded MCW Projects LLC, an advisory firm specializing in next-era philanthropic strategy and organizational wellness for leaders and collectives who want to make an impact. As co-founder and managing partner of Verge Agency, Lise K. Ragbeer has dedicated her 20-year career to creating access to a range of art experiences. She has organized several exhibitions, is the co-editor of Collecting Black Studies, The Art of Material Culture, and writes about race, identity, immigration, and cultural representation. Phyllis Hollis is a patron of the arts and an advocate for underrepresented artists and art professionals. Her podcast, Cerebral Women Art Talks, offers unique content created to engage and educate, to promote greater equality and equity within the visual arts community. James McAnally is the executive and artistic director of Counterpublic. McAnally's writing has been published widely, and he is a recipient of the Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for short form writing. And our host moderator today, Allison Glenn, is a curator and writer deeply invested in working closely with artists to develop ideas, artworks, and exhibitions that respond to and transform our understanding of the world. Glenn's curatorial work focuses on the intersection of art and publics. She is one of the curators of Counterpublic Triennial 2023. Thank you all so much for joining today, and I'll turn it over to you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you to all the panelists, and especially to the Brooklyn Rail for this wonderful invitation to be guest critic for the June 2023 issue. I felt there's been so much space created within this column and within this opportunity to honor the myriad voices that are shaping it. And it's been a joy to assemble this group of brilliant innovators in the arts and culture sector. For those of you who have yet to read this month's column, my provocation was inspired by a desire to collectively reflect. And a lot of that reflection is on how museums, galleries, and nonprofit arts organizations chose to respond to and show up for the calls for deep cultural shifts and the willingness to examine our organizational systems and operational structures that the intersecting pandemics of 2020 called for. To do this, I reached out to the brilliant minds of industry leaders, many of which who have joined us today. Thank you to the contributors for so carefully responding. And I'm going to start this conversation posing a question to each panelist, then open up to a larger collective dialogue. Melissa, I'd like to start with you. Philanthropy is changing, and 5 years ago, you started Arts Funders Forum as a platform to address what has been identified as the largest wealth transfer of our lifetimes. What are some of the ways that this next generation is funding, and how can we appeal to them?
Well, Allison, thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to the issue, to be here today, and this opportunity further introduced me to the work of the incredible colleagues on this call. So I'm honored to be here with everyone. Thank you. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone on this call that the arts are experiencing a crisis of relevance. And I thank you for framing this issue for us to explore that, which I think everyone touched upon in some way. And that crisis of relevance is resulting in a crisis of funding. So after 15 years as a fundraiser for museums and art schools, I launched my own advising firm, MCW Projects, in 2017. And in 2018, as you mentioned, started the Arts Funders Forum with a fellow consulting firm called M+D. And we are a media research, convening, and advocacy platform. We're dedicated to expanding private giving to the arts. And we created this platform and we started talking about it in 2016 because we were interested in and frankly worried by several intersecting cultural truths that we were seeing. So the first is that arts giving has decreased or pretty much remained stagnant as overall philanthropic giving in the United States has grown. It still represents close to only 4% of overall charitable giving, while other sectors have seen increased growth. The second cultural truth is that we're experiencing the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. It's estimated that over 60 trillion will be transferred over the next few decades, and that is already underway in a significant way. And in the midst of this massive wealth transfer, those that are inheriting this wealth do not consider the arts as essential. They're prioritizing giving to other sectors that better demonstrate their impact in driving social progress. And lastly, these new heirs and these wealth creators increasingly see philanthropy through a social justice lens, and they prioritize advancing social, racial, environmental justice, equity, and democracy. So AFF did our first research study in early 2019, and it illuminated some massive differences, not only in generational giving, but in generational perceptions of the arts and the arts industrial complex. We saw that next generation philanthropists are more process driven than transactional given. They care about how they give, not just what they give. That technology is a massive kind of conundrum for our sector, that our sector is searching for ways to better use technology to connect each other, connect communities to culture, institutions to resources, and especially to measure outcomes and impact. We've seen over our research and in 2019 that people want more and better funding collaborations and partnerships. We've seen that the emerging class of donors, these next-gen donors, view cultural philanthropy through the lens of social justice, and they really express an urgency to develop new methods of listening and learning, specifically in historically divested and marginalized communities. Also across the board, the need for a new narrative connecting the arts to social justice and also expressing the sector's value to society. We hear that the arts are a nice to have, but not a must have, and that they're also a status thing. We saw in our research that there was a huge issue with transparency and metrics. People wanted to see a move towards better metric measurement, impact measurement, and transparency in the arts. And we also saw in 2019 and still see an interest in emerging funding vehicles, that younger philanthropists and next-gen philanthropists are really calling for new ways to fund the arts, support artists and institutions. So this was all our research in 2019, and that all happened before this became a lot more pertinent and prevalent and vital once 2020 hit, as you mentioned, these intersecting crises and pandemics. So your question is solution-oriented. Thank you for that, which is what can we do to appeal to and partner with this next gen of supporters? And I really urge everyone to think about philanthropy as partnership, that it is people coming together to solve challenges and to bring things that are needed in society to the forefront. So what I've learned from my research and my work with philanthropists themselves, both individuals and grant-making organizations across all demographics, and what I've seen work with the clients that I've worked with to thrive in this new world that we're in, includes some of the things I mentioned in the Critics page article, which is we need to develop a much better practice of listening. And by listening, I mean like radical, authentic, and purposeful listening to our audiences and our communities, to the people on this call, the professionals and the practitioners. And also listening involves giving over the platforms that you may have to those that need it most, who don't have access to platforms. I would include all of that and much more in this act of listening that we really need to cultivate and develop in a new way. We also need to promote an environment of collaboration. We need to trust people who embrace experimentation and risk failure. Next-gen donors want to see that. They want to participate in an experimental process as it relates to philanthropy. We also need to develop stories and narratives that align the arts with social impact, not elitism, wealth, and status, which has been an issue with next-gen donors. They feel that many are excluded from the arts, and so we need to change that story and that narrative. We need to develop better impact, and we need to develop metric-driven philanthropy that drives process. And along with the partnerships, these bold and effective partnerships we develop with philanthropists to support artists and support creative entrepreneurs. We need more inventive technology for connection and access, better use of the technology that we have. We need honest storytelling. We need authentic and sustained investment in community building. And we need people we need to highlight the stories. We need to use our platform to highlight the stories of others, not necessarily the work that our organizations are doing. We need an abundance of transparency and trust, because that is a value of next generation donors that is largely missing from a lot of the work that has been done. And we need holistic, organizational-wide, industry-wide diversity and access as a system of care and wellness for those in our system and also outside of our system. And there's so much more. I could talk about this forever. I do. But for today, the last solution is really that, and what my article is about, is letting go of control and the ways that we've always done our business. The way we've done our business doesn't work anymore. And it's time for something new and fresh and to experiment. So that, I would say, is the largest thing to take away, is really question how we've been doing stuff, let go of the control, and put yourself in that vulnerable space of experimenting and trying new things. And it's okay. Failure's okay. I don't know why failure is okay in the tech world, but not okay in the art world. I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you. I was feverishly taking notes as you were sharing this. Thank you so much. And now I want to turn to Phyllis. So I think there's a really lovely connection and a segue between what Melissa's been sharing and Phyllis, the way that you've kind of implemented some of these strategies and the work that you're doing. So you're a self-proclaimed board capitalist turned arts patron, which I was so pleased with that position. And so I'd like for you to tell us a bit about why you started your Cerebral Women podcast, what Cerebral Women is, and what you hope to achieve with the program. And I think we also have a podcast. So please let us know when you'd like for us to cue it.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison, for inviting me to contribute, and thank you to the Brooklyn Rail. I'm excited to be here. My podcast is passion project that I took on after leaving Wall Street. A dear friend of mine, her husband invited me over to their house and set me up with the headphones and the mic. And I was asking them, what are you doing? And they said, you have a great voice. You like to talk to people. We think you should produce a podcast. So of course, I thought they lost their mind. They took a clip of it, added some Miles Davis in the background, sent it to me. And I listened and I thought, what the heck? I'm not really doing anything else. I love spending time with artists. So let me give it a try. So that was 4 years ago. It was summer of 2019. I started spending more time with artists, and, we talked for 2, 3, 4 hours. So I was loving it very much. So starting in January 2020, I featured my first artist, and I knew I needed to be consistent. So I was inviting people to my apartment. I hired a young sound engineer from Upwork, and the three of us would sit at my kitchen table, talk. We'd sometimes in the evening with a couple shots of tequila. But I was enjoying it so much. It really was therapeutic. I ask all the artists and the art professionals the same list of questions. And basically, it's a passion project, but it's also very a selfish act on my part, because after spending decades on Wall Street around people that valued material things and how big is your house, how fast is your car, I really was becoming a little bored, disenchanted. And interviewing artists, it really gave me some insight into how other people think. It gave me insight into these beautiful images that I was seeing, that I was captivated by on Instagram. And I wanted to know the human. I wanted to learn more about the human that was creating the work. Like, how do they think? How are they inspired? What was their childhood like? So the questions I asked really dive deep into the human being. Not, they aren't academic at all. I ask questions like, when do the titles enter the creative process? Do you listen to music? And I go so far to ask questions such as, do you feel Black art can be defined? Do you feel Latinx, Hispanic art can be defined? And I realized with time that those answers to those questions were very educational. So I was not only promoting the artist, but I was also educating an audience, an ignorant audience that might think that Latinx and Latina and Latino and Hispanic could apply to anyone who spoke Spanish. In doing this work, I actually have learned quite a bit myself. And it is therapeutic. I love it very much. I try to be consistent. I also make sure that the artist is pleased with the interview, so I let them listen to it in advance. Sometimes they may use the wrong gender identifier or say something they regret, so I will edit an episode. The work I'm doing, I do hope that people can learn that there are other ways to feel fulfilled in life other than material things, and how you can sit in front of a painting at a gallery or museum and actually feel it. You can get absorbed. And when I heard Titus Kaphar say, art will save us, I had no clue really what it meant. But the more time I spent speaking with artists, the more time I spent viewing art, the more I got to, I better understood what he was saying. And art has saved me. It has been very therapeutic. I appreciate the work they do. I appreciate the work that all of you do. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Great. Would you like us to play the clip?
Sorry, I left that part out. Yes, please. So this clip, I interviewed Antoine Sargent, and I liked this episode a lot because he was very honest and shared with us openly how he feels about the role of the collector, the role of the patron.
To the truth of what they're doing, and I think that is the role, really. Whatever their concerns, is to explore them deeply and as truthfully as possible.
What do you feel is the role of the artist?
I think the role of it's such a good question, because I think that's ever changing, and I think that there's not one particular role. I think that they just have to get to the truth of what they're doing, and I think that is the role, really. Whatever their concerns, is to explore them deeply and as truthfully as possible.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
the podcast is available online on Instagram. We'll get to that more when we are in questions. I'd like to turn to you now, Eunice, and speak a bit about the hyperallergic interview that you became well known for between you and Lise Ragbeer, who's also one of our contributors and panelists today. And the article was titled, "I Was a Black Lives Matter Hire." And in this interview, you candidly detailed the challenges of DEI, including your recruitment and subsequent departure of your former role as a curator of a museum in Canada. What compelled you to speak so openly, which was very risky? And what do you think could have helped you navigate this role more efficiently?
Thank you so much for this question, and also for inviting me to be part of this wonderful cohort of writers and contributors. And we got in touch after that article, so I know that what was written touched you in a way that made you want to invite me to participate. So I'm grateful to have been able to be interviewed by Liz for this. But I think the reason, like the more time is passing, the more I'm actually wondering why I spoke so candidly, because it has been risky and I feel like I'm still paying for that risk. But for me, what was really important was how I really wanted the truth to be out there. And one thing that I noticed after the article was published was how many people went through exactly the same thing. And one thing is that when these fantastic hires are like publicized, it gives faith to everyone who is in that field that they will have the opportunity to participate and to be part of a world that they have felt that they have always been like, working from the outside. And then you get in that field, and then you realize how violent it is for marginalized folks and for Indigenous and Black folks. And I just felt like if I had known, I would have been able to navigate it differently. And I was really sad and angry that it was something that everyone knew about, but no one wanted to talk about it. And I'm holding position as a affiliate professor in university, so I'm often invited to speak about what it is to work as a curator, what are the experience that I've been through as a Black curator in the field that I'm working in. And I've always been against gatekeeping, because it's often how marginalized folks are not able to get involved in curating or in the art field. So I try to give as much information as possible. I'm trying to give the good, the bad, everything that a student or like an emerging curator would need to know. I try to give as much as I can, just so that they know what it is, and that, curating is not just studio visits and like glamorous exhibition. I'm trying to give as much as I can. And for me, that article was also part of that, giving as much as I can, because I went through like almost a year of sick leave after, before I went public with that story. And when I would see people in the street that, the news has been going far and wide, especially in the city where I live, which is Montreal, and people would recognize me in the street and stop me and congratulate me. And I was like, you can't, I can't explain what's going on because I'm not well enough to talk about it, but it's not what it seems. And I just felt like it was important for me to say it, because I think that people should know exactly what they get into before consenting to getting into these things. And it's the same with, personal life, interpersonal relationships. And I think it should be the same with our work experiences, because we spend a lot of time at work. And for me, it's important for people to consent to what they get into. And for me, giving as much info was a good way to, to provide that information. And I'm also really aware that my experience is probably different than other people's experiences. But after going public, I spoke to the 4 other curators who also had my position, who were not Black curators and who went through pretty similar things. And it reads as my experience is particular because I'm the Black person saying it and I was hired in that particular context. But because all of the other curators went through it, I just wished I had a way to know it before I could get in that museum. And so I think that, I just wish to provide as much information for other people who would want to have that position made, Black or, white or otherwise. And I think that for me, what would I have needed to navigate that experience, to better navigate that work experience, was transparency, openness, training, support. And if the institution went clearly and told me that they couldn't provide that support, I could have, you know, I would have had the agency to find that help elsewhere, but I didn't have it. So those are definitely the things that that I wish I could have. And yeah, it was really interesting to hear Antoine Sargent in the podcast, in Phyllis's podcast, say that the artists needed to go to the truth of what they're doing. And I think that as a career, that's really what I want to do. And it goes, I mean, it has to go by me saying what has happened. So yeah, I mean, I hope this answers the question, but those were the things that I was thinking. And also, I have had many other colleagues and many other experiences where actually silence was used as a violence tool for people that were already marginalized. And you know, I was welcomed as this person that was going to represent change, but then in the end it was exactly the same. So I just wanted people to know that I just wanted people to know the truth. For me, that was just like the utmost important thing in that situation.
Well, thank you for your honesty. I think you're absolutely right. At times, you know, silence is, I appreciate your honesty around the tension of speaking out or not speaking out, wanting to create tools or a way of accessing resource because you didn't have it. And I think it's a great segue into Verge, which, you know, on the heels of this interview, Lise, the New York Times announced the launch of Verge, and you and Julia are going to speak in a bit about the organization. But I'd like to start with how you and Julia built this model, along with co-founder and managing director, Ola Mobolade.
Sure. Well, I first of all want to thank you, Allison, for this invitation, and Brooklyn Rail, and Eunice. You know, Eunice and I got close during that interview and that process, and I want to be clear that conversation was part of a process. There was a trust and a relationship that was built between both of us that I think we were holding each other in many ways, which might be a good segue to talk about Verge. And I apologize, I am in Brooklyn Rail. But the windows are open because it's kind of hot and there's a lot of stuff happening outside. So I don't know if you can hear it, but my apologies. But talking about Verge and how we hold people and our community, and also Melissa and Phyllis, the ways in which you both talked about this idea of radical, well, I'm saying radical, but listening, the importance of deep listening, and I think observing. So maybe a year before the conversation with Eunice, I wrote a piece that ended up being, it was an opinion piece. So really my opinion, this is not journalism. This was just me seeing that there were a lot of Black women specifically being invited into predominantly white institutions, and then they were leaving. And it was sort of a musing or a reflection on, I'm seeing this. Am I really seeing this? Because I'm excited about my peers moving into these positions, but I also know, because the community is quite small, you know, Black people, Black and brown people in a predominantly white art world, it's a small group of people, and people talk. So seeing people moving in and then hearing that people were moving out got me thinking. I wrote this opinion piece and was really shocked by the wave of responses to that piece, saying, this has happened to me. I'm suffering in silence. I've committed career suicide. I experienced racial trauma. I'm grieving. I don't want to move back into the pipeline. I'm extracting myself from this. I don't want to work in the art world anymore. So all of the intention on the behalf of white organizations to diversify their staff and their workplace was actually having the opposite effect. People were turning their backs on these institutions because of the ways in which they felt under-supported, under-resourced, and quite frankly, underheard. So, you know, one of the things that we were consistently hearing was the ways in which the institution had set them up and let them down, the ways in which the institution gave them a very short amount of time to sort of get up to speed with a limited lack of, or limited training, limited people not knowing who to ask questions to, not knowing, and Eunice, you and I spoke about some of this too, what are the questions to even ask? And very specifically, I want to be clear the difference between feeling welcome in a space and again, being heard in space. And I think as we're talking about the futuring of everything, the art world and beyond, it really means cultivating this practice of deep listening so that we can like broaden the ways in which even our current perceptions can be broadened as we take in other pieces of information beyond Instagram. Instagram is a great place to get information, but like if we can really, truly, deeply listen to people, there are other things that can happen. So Verge really grew out of this idea of aligning the ways in which we can hear each other in many ways. If the organization is saying, we need this to achieve our business goals, and the people in the workforce are saying, we need this to achieve our career goals so that we can help you achieve your business goals, it really was about creating this alignment. How do we connect both sides? It can't be that an organization can't support all of its people, and it can't be, and if an organization feels ill-equipped to support its people, we thought, what can we do to equip the organization to meet the needs of the people who they would like to hire so that everyone's aligned, all parties can thrive and move forward together. I mean, Julia and I and Ola, our third business partner, talk about this all day long. So I can go on forever, but maybe this, Julia, do you want to fill in? I don't know. We can tag team this. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just add, it's, you know, you've had a lived experience in the art industry and I've had a different lived experience. And I think we just saw so much that was wrong, and that like so easily, like just some very simple things could be fixed. Like, yes, there are big systemic things, but there are also some very simple things that can be done to help any employee have a better experience. And our part of what we wrote about in our text for the book Brooklyn Rail is just like the art industry is so far behind most other industries in having good business practices, being a good employer for the people who work in the industry. And, you know, we started Verge because we thought we could help.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I also was curious, Julia, you obtained certification through this process, right? Or before this process. Could you speak a bit about the steps you've taken as a human resources professional? And then what, maybe one or two tools that are crucial for our successful cultural change?
Sure. Yes, I am a senior certified professional in human resources. It's a very long acronym that I am teased because the acronym, it basically says Shroom. So my husband calls me a Shroomi. But no, I initially was employed by a gallery in Los Angeles as my title was managing director, but I was essentially the head of HR. And I was kind of dropped into this role because of lots of other experiences that I had, but it wasn't in human resources. And, you know, I was in a leadership position, and it can be hard to be taken seriously as a woman in a leadership role. And fortunately or unfortunately, sometimes these markers of external validation are necessary for people in power to acknowledge that women know what they are talking about. And I'd been in this HR plus role for a while. And I was teaching myself as I went along, sort of like as situations would occur, I would do a deep dive in how to, you know, handle benefits or COBRA or, you know, various nuances of California employment law. And on the people part of the HR side, I was mainly working on instinct. I'd been a curator and I was really sort of applying my care of people to this role. And I was going with my gut, what I knew to be equitable and ethically right and fair, but I wanted to be sure I was going about things the right way. So I decided to get this certification. And as I was studying for it, it was like I took a class for 3 or 4 months and then took this exam. And I realized I was also doing it for myself. It was a mountain to climb, a challenge for me. And as we were, we talked for about a year in the kind of the planning process for Verge, it became a really good, it was an added benefit for our new business and this passion project that we started, Lee, Zola, and I. And then you said what's crucial for change, right? That was your second question.
Maybe one quick suggestion or tool.
Yeah. Well, my bias is more people in arts and culture roles, and people in culture roles, like the human resource position. And we wrote a little bit about, not every person in a human resources role is a good person. Like, I think the idea that HR is like the bad guy and in it for the employer, that's become a thing in business. I would say more so in the past few decades, but HR positions really evolved as employee advocates. And I feel very strongly that that is a role that's necessary. And I think just generally in our industry, more people in leadership roles who really care about putting in the hard work to change a flawed system that benefits a privileged few.
Thank you. I feel like this is just segueing perfectly to James. And I've had the privilege of working with you over the past 2 years, and I think you're an incredible leader as co-curator of this iteration. So thank you. And so as co-founder and executive and artistic director of Counterpublic Triennial, you've created a new model for biennial work that's hyper-local and focused on artist-led legacy projects in deep collaboration with St. Louis-based arts organizations. How did you come to this biennial model, and are there goals to deepen this work?
Thank you for the invitation, Allison. It's been great to work with you over these past 2 years, and it's coming to a close in 3 weeks. It's hard to believe, but yeah. So speaking to this, it's interesting talking about a biennial, triennial in relation to some of the issues, because I think it's not an obvious choice, right? When you think of social change or even systemic change within the art world, like the biennial is kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum as it's typically received. And I think, personally, I was drawn to this in part with that question. I came to this work with a long history of working in kind of independent and artist-centric spaces and organizing. So that was the sort of longer lead of my career, and also very active in St. Louis, which itself is kind of a seedbed of social change in a lot of ways. And so that immediate proximity of kind of artists organizing and social organizing, seeing the ways in which, I think other people have spoken to this, the ways in which arts organizations were very slow to the uptake on that, kind of trailing behind in a lot of ways. But I think for me, I was interested to kind of reflect on it, like, what are the possibilities of this model? Like, is it inherently problematic, or are there actually like new opportunities through this? So, I was reflecting for myself and looking around at others who are facing kind of like burnout, but also a lack of maybe clear impact in their work in the arts field, and seeing that sort of the way the incessant rhythms of the art world from one exhibition to the next, there's sort of like this flow of the art world where it's kind of very hyper productive and deeply capitalist, and that sort of like feeling of having to be kind of one to the next. And I think, for me, this sort of triennial was an opportunity to step back and sort of interrupt that flow and say, what can happen if we slow down? What can happen if we kind of organize, gather ourselves, gather resources, gather community and partner towards specific ends? So, for one, it was that kind of interruption of maybe like the pace of the art world, but also, I think very intentionally trying to play the instrument of the institution differently, trying to understand, okay, within this triennial, how, starting from the ground up, what could we put in place to do it differently? So you have a 3-year time window to do something profound. Take advantage of that time, think deeply about it. So, you know, as you know, seeing the process, right, for us, it meant the first year we weren't talking to artists. So Allison referenced, we worked together for 2 years towards a 3-year project. Well, that first year was really community engagement. So before we were thinking about artists and what people were going to make and put into spaces, you know, we talked to almost 1,000 people in the process in St. Louis, in the neighborhoods that we're working, and kind of said, you know, what does it look like to be invited into this space, into neighborhoods where people are living? It's kind of like, in some ways, some basic community organizing tools, right? Like ask people what they need, ask people what they want, and then show up with kind of what you can do in response. And I think that, so for us, it was very much a listening first process. And I feel like this is one thing that, you know, shouldn't be groundbreaking. It could be baked into all of our processes. So one, you know, which we're trying to be clear on documenting how we did it and what we did so that it becomes more normalized, right? Like if you're working in public and in community, right, take the time to start first with, you know, what are on your community's mind. So from there, this sort of like longer trail, right? Like that's maybe the prelude work of slowing down the biennial or triennial approach. But otherwise, we were also thinking about the kind of longer duration of impact, like using our temporariness of a 3-month high profile, high visibility exhibition towards longer durations of change. So how do we connect our exhibition cycle to cycles of change in our community specifically? So in going into the process, we identified kind of some of our core partners, you know, for 2023, that was starting to work with the Osage Nation, whose ancestral land St. Louis occupies, and kind of going to them first, going through their tribal protocol to be invited to work in some of their sacred spaces. It was also working with a site that Allison specifically is deeply engaged with, the Griot Museum of Black History, a 25-year-old community museum, and really just going to them and asking, what is your vision? What do you want? And how do we actually sort of amplify and extend it and take it into new terrain maybe, but really as a capacity building partner, do something change. So, you know, we were thinking about that, and to be, I guess, concrete about it, you know, for the Osage Nation, it was to not only kind of like engage the sort of representation of their work, the artist, or to bring attention to a site, but we're working at kind of the last intact native mound in the city of St. Louis, which is known as Mound City. It's has been a kind of central gathering site for Native people for millennia. And so for our work, we connected both artist commissions with also a process of rematriation or repatriation of land. So a land back process in which, you know, we would not only kind of bring the artistic maybe overlay to a space, but we were actually using our position as an arts organization to maybe bring in different resources to the table or different perspectives to the table that allowed for a more clear view towards the return of the mound itself. So that's one case, but throughout the kind of triennial, in the many curators involved, there is this sort of understanding of kind of what brought us to this moment, but also what are we leaving behind, and that kind of being a guiding light that led us to looking to history through repair, repatriation, reparations, and really kind of being clear about that, saying it early on that this is what we're trying to do. So it's also a transparent, like we can be held accountable to that, right? So we're accountable to our community, saying like, this is what we're trying to do, and you can follow that process in some way. So I think that's some of that. I can stop there for now. Counterpublic, it's a project that there's 3 weeks left of it, but you know, in this like longer cycle, some of our work really will only start at the closing in many cases. So it's really we are thinking of the exhibition as something that's really permeable in time. It has longer threads than its moment of maybe visibility. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And now I'd like to move into asking groups of you a specific question. So Lise, Julia, and Melissa, from diversifying leadership to successful fundraising, why do you think arts organizations in our field are struggling to implement long-term change? And I think I'll start with you, Melissa, and then move to Lise and Julia.
Wow, that was, just took so many notes on what everyone said. That was so great. Okay. Well, sticking with the theme of what I wrote, I think it all goes back to the fear of relinquishing control and the fear of change. And, the world is changing faster than some of our leaders and our boards are willing to change themselves or change the institutions or implement change. But I would also say, as part of that, an unwillingness. I mean, listening has been a through line of a lot of what everyone has said today. So I think not listening to your audiences, not listening to your communities, which includes your staff, your internal community, is preventing people from knowing the truth and also preventing people from feeling safe to make change. And I would also say that as someone that runs a research program and thinks data is invaluable right now in moments of change, that folks just aren't really paying attention to the data. If you do, and you read some of these research studies like ours, you read about the work of my colleagues with Generation Impact and others, you see that things are rapidly changing, and you see what next generation audiences and supporters tell you they want. So pay attention to the data, listen to the data, and let that data give you confidence in order to make change, would be what I think.
Lise, you want me to go? Well, something Lise and Ola and I talk a lot about is, again, I touched on this earlier, but this industry we've been complacent in allowing business leaders to maximize profit over people. And the excuse is that, we're doing this work because we love it and we love the artwork and we love the artists. But the practices that lead to getting the art on the wall are not okay. And we've been making excuses. And I think more workers and employees are waking up to this fact. It is going to take a long time to change a flawed system, but if business leaders don't try to get ahead of the curve in this, their businesses are going to fail. I mean, I think that's a pretty A to Z equation. But we do have to think about change in terms of years, not months. And I think the people who aren't able to think that way are just greedy or too short-sighted. We also talk a lot about just needing a shared code of ethics. I think I think that business owners, the C-suite, middle managers should be required to take professional continuing education courses, understanding basic employment law, best practices in running a business, and basic tenets of people management. There's so much Wild West business practices, again, really focused on maximizing profit and ignoring people. But those kinds of things are the baseline. There's lots of work to be done beyond that. And this industry is far behind. So I think focusing on the baseline is the only place to start. I would love to see this kind of work incentivized through professional organizations. I mean, we have ethics of care for art collections. We have standards for museums to be accredited. Why not for how museums and galleries operate as employers? We're in a new era of the job market, employee rights, and I'm looking forward to seeing the businesses that are able to keep up with the times.
Allison, I just want to add two quick things. One, I feel like a piece of that too is how we talk about accountability and measure accountability. There's a lot of talk about, ideal workplace cultures or ideal diversity initiatives, but a lot of this gets siloed and, you know, sort of it doesn't move past conversations, certain echo chambers. So how do we hold people accountable? What does accountability look like? And who are we holding accountable? And also, you know, everyone here has sort of spoken about it in one way or another, the speed, like people have to be really clear that, you know, centuries undoing a system that has supported one group of people for centuries is going to take time. It's not going to take 2 years. It's not going to take a day. It's not going to take an hour-long workshop. It's going to take years. And I think we have to look very honestly at that. That's an uncomfortable thought. But if we can't look and sit with that discomfort, when we're not going to move to the place where we all need to go together. And let's be clear, we all need to move in this direction. This is not just about moving BIPOC people in a certain direction. This is about moving everybody together in a direction so that we can all thrive and all of our interests can thrive.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. James and Eunice, how does care intersect with your curatorial practices and leadership styles?
I can answer that. I used to talk a lot about care, especially as a curator, because, you know, the root of the name curator comes from care and all of that. And I used to really like grab onto the root of the word just to kind of like, you know, push further the work that I was doing or give it a direction. And now I hear more and more how care has been used and reused, and oftentimes used, you know, when you use something to a point where it loses its meaning. Sometimes I feel like this happened to the word care. So I'm not sure how I feel about it now, but I do know that it's still, that it's still, you know, it still nourishes my curatorial practice. And right now, the way care intersects with my curatorial practice is that you know, for me, transparency is really important, because the way I curate is oftentimes I collaborate with artists, and I really want to make sure that there is transparency in the relationship between me and the artist, but also between the artists and me. And also I always looked at care as a way to respect the ideas and eventually archive the ideas of artists. And this is something that that is still very important in the way that I frame my curating, is that the final object is just like the happy result of a process that often includes a lot of invisible work. And I really want to make sure that this invisible work is also celebrated and put forward as much as the final result that everyone has access to. And also obviously clear expectations of how we want to work, what we do as work together is extremely important. So there's also like a very clear discussion of what we want to do and how we want to do it. And one thing that I often think about as a curator is how it's important for the curatorial idea not to overshine, or, you know, not to go beyond the artist's work. And that's why often when I work with artists, I'm more interested in what they have to say more than what they're actually doing, because then it gives them space to, you know, create and make mistakes and have accidents happen that we can work on. And it really resonated with what you said, Melissa, about allowing accident and mistakes to happen. I think curating should be the place to frame that and be able to offer those mistakes and accidents to the public. And one thing that is also very important is aftercare, which is not often something that we talk about. And I think the aftercare is as important. Once the curatorial relationship is coming to an end, you still need to hold each other in that moment, rather than, you know, go your separate ways because the project is actually finished, to make sure that it's not just the project that is the vessel of your collaboration, but something more that happened throughout the work that we've done together that needs to be maintained. And I think that's something that I want to work more on, is the aftercare in curating.
I love that. Hard to follow, but I'll try to respond or build on it in some way. Is I think the kind of aftercare is a super important part of this, and I think, you know, maybe taking it in a bit different direction. I think with responding to the idea of like a curator as a caretaker or sort of involved, I think it's typically, as it's been understood through history, as one who takes care of objects, right? This sort of like displacing that care onto objects as opposed to people. And I think building that care in terms of collaborations with artists is huge. And I think, speaking for myself, where I'm kind of hybrid between being a curator and being a director and having these different roles, I think a lot about actually the sort of care that has to be extended outward, like into public. So like the care between what you as a curator and artist have made together, and then where that enters the world actually like is a super important process, because that's kind of how it lives. And I think, you know, in a project in which we're operating in, you know, 25 different sites, many of which are quite charged, you know, that care on how people are invited in to experience something, and the sort of flow around the experience, I think is, you know, at least where my mind is right now, and just thinking about the sort of different levels of care and attention throughout that. You know, using maybe a specific examples, like we're working with a local collective called the Black Healers Collective in St. Louis, and like they're performing a kind of like healing ritual, but also holding a space, like understanding that like some of the sites we are engaging in St. Louis have quite a lot of trauma around it. So like part of the work is like inviting people who do have that kind of skill and experience and training to actually hold that space, that like is not something that maybe I as a curator have that training, but like understanding that sometimes you have to surround the work with care in different ways. And I think, again, yeah, that moment where art meets the world is quite vulnerable. And I think in this particular moment especially, I think there's a lot of effort that we could put into understanding how art circulates more thoughtfully.
Thank you both for those answers. My last question before I ask one more question to the group and then open up is for Phyllis and Melissa. And Phyllis, we talked about Cerebral Women, but you also have an active role on MoMA's Black Arts Council. So I just wanted to share that because I think it sets the stage for how you'll answer this question. So Phyllis and Melissa, what role do philanthropic leaders, both individuals and granting organizations, play in changing this climate?
So across the board, I think it's crucial that leaders are open to change, open-minded and introspective. And agreeing with Melissa, it's important to focus on the data. I think we also, or leaders also, need to ask themselves the question of what are the consequences of viewing art as an asset class or as a status symbol versus viewing it as a way to educate us, a way to inform us about other cultures, its positive impact on mental health. And those two things combined, being introspective and asking the question of where is the value of art. You know, if you look at the data, perhaps those things combined will help leaders better engage and connect with the next generation, the future generation. But bottom line is, you know, what purpose does arts serve? Is it social status, or is it to help our country be healthier mentally?
I love that. I would add to that, again, educate yourself on the data. What is happening? What do people want? Listen to people. And I would also say think big. I think, think policy change, think really large, big picture level, not necessarily change at the small micro granting level. We need everything. We need more folks involved from different sectors, from different areas, from different generations, from different backgrounds involved in how we structure philanthropy and also how it's executed. But I also think we have a tendency to think too small and not think big enough. And I think this goes back to what Phyllis was just saying about the relevance and the stories and how can we implement change at the larger levels and use the platforms that we have as arts leaders, as artists, as cultural entrepreneurs to bring about large scale societal change versus the small kind of day-to-day, I don't mean day-to-day, but the smaller piecemeal change, which feels sometimes like a Band-Aid, but really starting to think big about how we could implement change at a larger level, I think is crucial to pushing all of this forward in a more equitable way that's better primed for funding our sector, not just for the next 5 years or to get through the next crisis, but in perpetuity.
Thank you. And I have one question for the group. And Lisa, I think I'll ask you to start us off and then we'll just run through. It's quite a provocative question, at least I think it is. So in your opinion, have we lived up to the promises of the reflective moment that 2020 provided? And then after you answer that, could you give us a resource, maybe someone you're learning from, a website, a book, a colleague, organization, something that viewers and listeners could take as a resource to start understanding where you're coming from? And you're also muted, please.
Yeah, as I'm being mindful of time, I will say, absolutely not. We've not lived up to what could have been a moment for great pivot and success. And I would say resource and this is not self-promotion, let me just say. But I would say listen to people more, and that article with Eunice has so much, or that conversation with Eunice just sheds light on all of the ways in which the industry continues to fall short, and also highlights the ways in which intention has a long way to go to match with impact. That's it.
And is there a resource you could add?
Another resource besides that interview and listening to people?
That's perfect. I was thinking of like a link. We'll just follow up with links afterwards. So
okay. I'll think about another resource and maybe you guys can come back to me.
I can add, well, ditto to what Lee said. I agree that we haven't lived up to the moment. I feel like we were silly putty and we stretched a little bit and then we kind of snapped back. But it gives me hope that there's, there are possibilities. And a resource I've been reading, Ruchika Tulshun's Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. It's a great book, and she's also written a couple of really eloquent pieces for the Harvard Business Review. So I'm really into her writing.
I can answer that. I mean, obviously, the answer for me is no. But one thing that I'd like to give as a resource is our own bed. I mean, for me, one thing that really helped me go through everything was to sleep and just to take a step back. But also in the last few months, I've been on the writing residency, which was I will write it on the chat. It's at this center in the province of Quebec called Est Nord-Est, and right now they're really looking into in French we would say décroissance. So I would assume it would be like decreasing the, our workflow. And it's just, the space was amazing because we were able to research and experiment in any way we wanted. So some artists, their experimentation was really in the doing and in the making, and others it was really in thinking and taking walks. And I think that taking a step back would be the ideal way to protect ourselves from that rhythm. And yeah, so those are the things that I'd like to add, to put in this pool of resources.
I'll comment. I'll say no. And I think we should question, what does representation mean? How is it measured? How do you measure the impact? And my resource for me is my podcast, because I've never taken an art history class, but every time I interview someone, I learn so much. And I'm interviewing artists as well as art professionals who've, have PhDs, MFAs. And so I learn something every single time I interview somebody.
I'll go against the grain a little bit. I'll say maybe, kind of just like that, in that awareness is the first step, right? Acknowledging you have a problem is the first step. And I feel like in the last couple of years, sometimes from unlikely sources, there has been an acknowledgement that there's a problem. And so I think, as we've said, change is really, really slow. But I think we have, as an industry, some awareness now of the challenges that face us on all different levels. I think now that the work is putting these conversations into action, right? And bringing them outside of just our sector, but engaging folks from other sectors and other leaders in these conversations. And as it relates to resources, that's what I would say is I really look to folks who've developed new models of community building and philanthropy in other sectors. And it's a key tenet of the Arts Funders Forum of what we can learn from other sectors. And I'll mention two. One is the writing of Anand Girdadas, who's an author based in Brooklyn, specifically the book Winners Take All, which takes a broad look at philanthropy and where philanthropy is and how it needs to change. And his next book, which was called Persuasion, I think has a lot to teach folks in the art world about how can you persuade people over to your side in a very, very polarized world. And then I would, for an organization, I would recommend everyone take a look at Run for Something, which is a political organization that recruits young, diverse folks, specifically from BIPOC and queer communities, to run for office in the United States. And they've built such a great structure and such a great fundraising mechanism, really talking about why we need the change we do and how they're going to implement that. I was lucky enough to interview the CEO of that on our recent Arts Funders Forum talk, which I can include, and just really brilliant ideas that I think are very pertinent for the work that we do. So I'm optimistic, but very, very, very cautiously optimistic.
James, I think that leaves you.
Right. I would say agreeing, I think, with most. On a systems level, I have not seen much progress. It's inching along, maybe. I think most concerning is like related to something Melissa you said at the very beginning, which is kind of arts organizations adopting some of the language of social change without actually practicing it is, I think, the most dangerous change I've seen since 2020 is like, right, we've learned the language without learning the action. So that's the thing that, yeah, concerns me the most. But in general, I think, I'm hopeful seeing specific examples of that change happening. I look around and see it in moments, but systems wide, I don't think that we've seen it so much. In terms of, I guess, organizations, references. So starting one place I look to a lot is Candace Hopkins' work at Forge. Right now is an example of some of those efforts that I really respond to and learning from. And then maybe as a kind of reading, this is semi self-promotional, I'll put it in the chat, is kind of going into organizing counterpublic understanding that like, right, like we're not singular or distinct, and there's a lot to learn from others. So we organized a series of conversations of other founders, artistic directors of different biennials and triennials globally, that I think that there's a lot to learn from those contexts as well, in a much broader sense. The last one that we published was a conversation with between the Lagos biennial and Lumumbashi biennial, in which they were reflecting on the kind of roots of this structure being one of colonialism. And like, right, so I think that that's an ongoing kind of reflection in which I hadn't seen anything really in the biennial triennial world. So we invited folks to be in conversation. That's it for me.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation today. It's adjectives don't do it justice, but definitely we're very grateful to have heard from you all today. And we have a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to go to Vicky first, and you should be able to unmute to ask your question.
This has been a very great conversation. I'm enjoying the art talk. My question was, is there a national art organization, say for instance, Black curators, Black collagers, Black art podcasters who can get together or meet to share their unique difficulties, financing experiences, best practices of support? The reason I said that is because I'm a Black optometrist, second to graduate from University of California, Berkeley. All the years that I would go to meetings and stuff, I would probably be the only one. And when I went to the National Optometric Association, which was a gathering of Black optometrists, and I felt that's the first time I ever felt support, to realize that people dealing with the public as a Black woman, that others were having the same kind of experiences I was having. And I've been in this group for over 45 years. I just graduated 45 years ago. But I'm just wondering, is there a Black national organization where the artists, the podcast folks can come together, not just Black, but Latinx, Hispanic group? Because you're going to have a different experience than the majority of the artists that are out there. Just like, I guess Eunice was saying how she was having problems being a curator, and the fact that she's, the experience that she's having, and I'm sure I pretty much know a lot of the things she's having, you're not going to get the support unless you get it from somebody who actually looks like you, to tell you the truth. Like I said, in the United States, there are only, out of probably 60,000 optometrists, 2% are Black, less than 2% are Black. That means like 1,200 in the whole country. Hispanics, only about 5%. So that's my question.
Vicky, I left a link in the chat. It was, I am part of the Black Curators Forum, which is a contemporary curators forum based and mostly with Canadian Black curators. And we once wrote an open letter about the state of the art milieu in Canada. So I added that on the chat for you to read.
Okay, I will definitely read it. Thanks. Thank you.
And then Phyllis, of course, the Black Arts Council at MoMA.
Yeah, the Black Arts Council, I'm surprised they haven't kicked me off yet, because I feel very strongly that change is important. And I feel very strongly that we should engage with young people and listen to what they have to say. The group was established a little bit more than 30 years ago. So everybody is, plus 30 years older. And like I said, I'm surprised they haven't kicked me off the committee yet, but I keep emphasizing that we need to engage with young people, and some feel MoMA has done a really great job. I should say, so the MoMA's Black Arts Council was established 30 years ago. The name change took place recently, but it's just important that we have younger voices. We need to listen, and what does representation really mean, and how do you measure it? Yes, you use the data, but it's just so important for young people, for children, and for artists of color, and for artists, art professionals of color, to have a platform. So I'm glad to be involved with MoMA because they're substantial, but changes is needed everywhere, and no institution has done enough. And there is one more question that I have that I wondered about when I was reading the stories and the challenges with art institutions having the impact they want to. And what I'm still learning is the different roles that different galleries play, right? Some cater to the communities, some cater to the careers of the artists. And, you know, where do those overlap? And working together, how can the two different areas of focus complement and support each other? But it seems to be a fine line on what the role of the gallery is and the role of the curator. I appreciate all the work you do, all of you. Like I said, I've saved a lot of money on therapy, being involved with people in the visual arts versus just finance. So thank you all.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Vicky, so much for that question. And we will be collecting all the resources that have been mentioned today, and we can send those to everyone that's registered, because this is quite a list. So let's see, our next question is going to be from GE, and you can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you so very much, Carolyn. And I know this, you know, reading through the essays and then, of course, listening today, thinking there's something else maybe also to be about here. Can you talk a bit about how we seem to be living in this sort of attention economy and how that's profoundly changed how we engage in all art?
I'd like to answer to that.
Yes, please.
One thing that happened, in 2020, I was working at a university gallery, and then, you know, the pandemic happened, and then gallery closed, and we had artworks that were still in the gallery. And, you know, the artists were sending me emails and they were worried about what was going to happen. And then I realized I didn't want to have like and the website of the gallery that I was working at was just horrible. So there was no way I could use the website to present images. And then I was like, I don't want to use Instagram as a way for people to see the art, because it was just going to be another another time of people just looking at their phone and just being part of all of this, like, oversharing of images. And so what I decided to do was to ask the artists to write me their concerns in a letter that would be slowly sent in the newsletter of the gallery. And this really, for me, it started a way for me to get to archive artistic practices with something else than images. And I was trying to find a way to stop feeding into that overconsumption of image. I'm still working on that, but it was definitely something that I noticed was how by wanting to support one another, we just became, overfed with images, which means that you can't actually support anyone because you have so little of your attention focused on other things than looking. So I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I add one thing, actually?
Yeah.
I was going to be quiet, but I couldn't help myself. I think linking the attention economy to this idea of listening, and our, as a society, our increasingly increasing struggle of listening and hearing other people you know, that's one of the side effects. And when you're talking about philanthropy and relationship building and partnering, I see a lot that organizations and donors just aren't listening to each other. There's just such a disconnect, and they may share the same desire to make change, and they might be perfectly aligned, but they're not able to listen. So I think in terms of our relationship building as well, you know, it's getting us into quite a cycle of the inability to listen. So I think, again, like we were talking about taking the time, and Eunice was talking about taking the time and rest and care, it's important to kind of reset that and work on our listening skills.
Thank you, Melissa and Eunice, for those answers, and thank you, GE. Our last question today before our closing poetry reading will be from Fong Bui. Go ahead, Fong, you can unmute. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you all. I read it several times. The critic page is just so incredibly inspiring. And I mean, I think the only person I know well in this panel is Phyllis, because Phyllis was graciously committed some of her time and supporting, I think it might have been 2008. Our benefit, Phyllis, was as a school visual art gallery. So it's good to see you. And thank you for doing what you have done, Allison and company. It's going to be historic. It's going to be in the archive. People are going to reread it and reread it again. But I have one very, challenging question. Just because of one of our good friends, Jim Melcher. You might remember he might have been the first to run the National Endowment for the Arts, for way back. And he was telling to us, I mean, he sent people out to see site visit. And that was one of the jobs that I think no more than 4 people did in the whole entire United States, really. And they had to meet the founder, meet the staff, spend some time with the institution before give them the support, And in regard to, philanthropy, Melissa, this is what makes the U.S. is so unique, because the European wealth, the great wealth and aristocrat do not feel compelled, and they're not required to give the funding to support culture. It's the government that does it. In America, however, it's philanthropists who do a lot of that, and they will inspire some way to some of the idea from the beginning, whether it's the National Endowment or the NEA or the NEH. And I just rereading the beginning, the history of the Neil, how she and her husband, John, Dominic and John, was so politically mindful, spending time with the governor, with LBJ, all kind of incredible right-wing politician also, to mediate the both of the political differences to come and support. And they were very highly successful. It's very interesting to know that. But as you know, big organization, whether it's Ford, the Mellon, big one, don't always send people out to meet anybody. It have a certain kind of bureaucratic machinery, which if you're lucky, you might get to speak to somebody after years and years and trying. So that's my most frustrated question for you guys. It's like, how can we inspire them to be a little bit more agile, to pay attention to the street, instead of funding the same organization that sometimes don't do any work anymore, became so bureaucratic, so complacent. And that's like the most, I don't know, urgent question I have for you guys. If you can help me to illuminate on the matter, how can we inspire those big philanthropists, Anybody can answer, I don't know. Maybe Melissa, can you go first?
God, I mean, if we knew the answer to that question, solved, right? I think, I'll go back to this recent talk I did. It was really fun, Allison. Thank you for moderating, and really fun for me to be a panelist and not a moderator. I go back to the recent talk I did for our online series with Amanda Littman, who I mentioned from Run for Something, Abby Pucker from Chicago, founded Gertie, and Michael Farber, who founded an organization called Breakout. And we were talking about how there's such an opportunity for next generation supporters and audiences to make systemic change through their philanthropy, because politics is philanthropy, art is politics. So why aren't political donors invested in the arts? This kind of ongoing question. And that by getting involved in the structure, in governance structures of organizations, next geners can really start to move the needle on systemic issues and drive impact in the areas that they care about the most, and that are areas that need the most urgent change. I think there's a lack of education about that, and there's a kind of distrust of governance structures. And instead of just distrusting it and walking away, how can we compel these folks to get involved in leadership levels to actually drive change in the organization that can drive change in the community? And I think it's just in the messaging and the repositioning about what our impact can be, and why their particular viewpoint or background or experience is vital to making the change in our sector, but also through our sector for society at large. I will say that this is becoming an increasingly global issue. As you mentioned, the European model of philanthropy has been different, but increasingly it's becoming more similar, specifically in the UK, because the governments have really pulled back their funding and are looking to individual and philanthropists and grant-making organizations to fill that hole. They're largely looking to Americans, so like Friends of the Louvre, Friends of Cambridge, all these organizations in the US. But they're encountering the same issues we've been encountering. And so this is increasingly becoming a global issue, and then, Asia as well. So that sort of, brings me a little hope that we'll kind of grow our pool of advocates for making this change. But I think, again, those narratives that connect the work in the arts and the work of artists and creative entrepreneurs to driving change in communities, both local and international, is going to pull people in, and it's telling a different story than we told their predecessors, their parents, their elders, which was a very different story we told in the post-war era in America with regards to philanthropy. We now need to tell a different story.
Okay, that sounds convincing. Would you like to add a little bit more, Julia or Allison? James, or?
I had actually messaged James in the chat. He's an incredible fundraiser. And so I kind of said, you should really go for this if you feel comfortable. So James, maybe you have some things to add.
And I can think about it. I mean, rooting back to the question, right? Some of it is the distinction between like maybe national philanthropy and local. And I think that experience of actually like funders being closer to what they're funding is actually a good invitation. That's one I think that helps sort of short circuit some of maybe the abuses of funding that we see out there. So I think that that's the kind of practice that you would want to kind of actually lean into for somewhere like the NEA, where having like local engagement, like I've served on the other side where I was like a panelist many times for the NEA, including like the CARES Act and things. And I think they do a reasonably good job of trying to like source people from around the country that understanding their limits of understanding. But yeah, I mean, I think using a foundation example like the Andy Warhol Foundation is good at this, right? Like they're, at least pre-COVID, their grant officers would always go around the country and go to these small spaces. And when you look at what they're funding, it's quite different than a portfolio of almost any other foundation. And I think that's notable. Like they get much closer to the kind of smaller artist spaces, and they talk to people in the cities and be like, what do you actually Like,
Yeah.
what are the spaces that artists spend time in, or what are the spaces that really are valuable in a community? And I think that getting closer, like, so inviting philanthropists closer is, I think a good outcome there. So that's my sort of distilled answer.
No, it's a good answer. I'm just very lucky. I'm fortunate enough to sit on Aggie Gun Studio in the school. And I know that Aggie never give away money unless she have visited the institution, known what people do, and she's coming back. So it's not just one time only. It's a perpetual relationship that she's building very intimately. So, so I learned a lot from her and met a lot of people from her also, James. But all right, one more quick question. I mean, I'm being a little greedy here, but there's also an issue, I don't know you experience this, because I sit on many boards and committee and whatnot, and it's been a uphill battle to advocate not just for marginalized artists and but also the older artists, older intellectual, because America favor youth and its energy. And I don't know, you read the rail, so you see that a very serious high conscious on our behalf to reach out to older artists and writers and whatnot. We was the first to recognize Carmen Herrera, Stanley Whitney, Jack, even Jack Wood and nameless others, mix them up with younger people. But the frustration is sometimes a lot of institutions fail to do that. And I don't want to name names, especially big award, where they favor young emerging artists. One of the places that I sit on is Anthology Film Archives. And we have been struggling to get support. And I just recently spent some time with Jim Jarmusch, who's a friend. And we had to find a way to see whether Hollywood people can support anthology to generate the kind of fermentation that is so needed in the margin, the experimental film. How many Rambo sequels must we see? Star Wars, it will on and on and on forever. How do we cultivate that space so young people feel comfortable, encouraged, and inspired to experiment? I like the idea of experiment you guys talked earlier to failure of it all. That you was talking, Eunice, artists and curator need to experiment and fail. So that I'm concerned about that. So, maybe it's not a question, it's just a concern of mine. Thank you.
So I will say, early on in my podcast, when I interviewed Carrie Mae Weems, she asked me to promise her that I would feature some elders. And I most recently, a few weeks ago, featured Thaddeus Mosley, who's 97. And part of my agenda is to make sure that I expand the canon by making sure these artists that are fabulous and the knowledge they have that they can share with us. It's very important to me that I feature them. So yeah, I agree with you for sure.
That's terrific. Yeah. Anyway, yes, thank you all. It's the knowledge that turns into wisdom, and we need the wisdom from the elder generation so they can pass on the baton. So profoundly grateful to Allison, to you, Melissa, Phyllis, of course, and Eunice, and who else here? James, of course. And it's just terrific. I sent out several issues to all kind of friends in Europe and Asia. And so they loving it. And so thank you for being together to amplify our social intimacy against social distancing. So yes, thank you. Back to you, Carolyn.
Hey, thank you, Fang. So here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Estelle Araya-S, to the stage. Estelle Araya-S has recently been published in Los Angeles Review of Books. She received her MFA from Bard College in 2020, and she lives and works in Los Angeles. I'll turn it to you, Estelle.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me today. I feel so honored to share some writing after the brilliant and rigorous conversation everybody's brought to the table on extremely important issues that affects the entire ecosystem. And for the piece that I wrote for this conversation, I am really writing from an artist's perspective, though I think a lot of it kind of ties into all the different other players that are so important in making this whole world happen for all of us. And the piece is called Powering Down. Let the archaic institutions that are new and old figure out that they'd be nothing without the dazzling brilliance and life force of artists. And yet in many forms and many spaces, there are stakeholders who will let artists suffer, will push artists to their edge, and will pilot how little they can give artists, and will trial artists' faith in themselves and their world. And yet institutions know precisely how prized the energy, determination, and stamina of artists are, how crucial or magic is. We bring life and lucidity into rooms, ideas, objects, symbols, bodies, speech, and time. We're often on the frontier of something they wish they were on the frontier of. We offer something fragile and essential that, if removed from the distraction of economy, status, and notoriety, is glaringly about life itself and its non-communicable complexity that at times profoundly changes the direction of an audience's existence. In fact, we are capable of summoning an infinite number of realities that lift others up, scorch spectators with sorrow, and instill desire, confusion, and so many other states of being. It appears obvious to me that we are precious, and yet for some, our worlds are always on the verge of collapsing. How do artists keep the scaffolding up and the lights on? How do we keep our worlds alive when so many stakeholders encourage the disappearance of that essential magic, depriving us and themselves of a future where ideas can rest and be discovered? What happens when an artist's world comes to a halt or powers down? If we are let down, where does our honesty and curiosity take us? On the verge of loss, sometimes we're our most radical selves, but we aren't at the peak of our strength. What then? What if we are dried up? What if we recognize that there is a crisis of assimilation? Depending on one's orientation, it's just not possible for all of us to be compatible with archaic systems of belief and operations. There can be a spasm, a repulsion, a need to leap somewhere else. Sometimes it's a terrible fit. Despite our strength and capacity as world builders, we leap because we forecast a perilous encounter with abominable limits. Or we start digging through the earth of our minds until there's a trench no one else wants to go in some new world where we are not the most deprived version of ourselves, where we need to persuade no one, and our histories do not have to fold. We can finally make magic. As everything falls away, and for whatever returns to us, how good we are at finding the necessary conditions to be exactly who we need to be. But also, how strange it is that one of the distinct beauties about being an artist is that your illusion of meaning could be said to not exist. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Estelle. That was just, yeah, incredible. Whoa, thank you all. Thank you for today. Thank you, Eunice and Melissa and Julia and Lise and Phyllis and James and of course, Allison. It's been so wonderful to have you all on our NSE today. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program. This conversation has been recorded and will be up in our archive shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading with Lorraine Lupo and Paul Maziar. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for today.
Hello and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all. Thank you so
Thank you all
much.
so much.
Thank you all.
Bye, thank
Conversation
you.
today.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Inspiring talk.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you,
Thank you,
Allison.
Paul.
That was so good. Thank you for the reading also, Estelle. Beautiful reading.
Yes.